What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, well then, hello. My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining us today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am going to be chatting to the author of the Wolf Den trilogy, meaning I am sitting down with none other than ELODIE HARPER. Now, for today's video, we are going to be diving into the final installment of this trilogy, which is so beautifully sitting behind me, titled The Temple of Fortuna. However, along with that, I just want to make it clear now, we will not be doing any spoilers until the end of the video. So this interview will be split up into two distinct parts. The first part will be discussing the final installment, as well as a lot of the other decisions that were made throughout the series of the whole Wolf Den trilogy, and discussing sort of how they ended up culminating in the final book that you guys can now officially order. That link is in the description below, so do not be shy at any point to go and order the book. But then the second part of the interview will be more so spoiler questions, right? So that's where we'll get into things that if you haven't read this book, I'll remind you guys when that time comes to switch off the video, because the last thing that I want to do is spoil this series for anybody, because you guys who are regulars will know that this is one of my favorite historical fiction series ever. So with all of that being said, that was quite a long intro, ELODIE. So why don't you start us off with reminding us what the series is about and what to expect from the Temple of Fortuna?
Okay, the Wolf Den trilogy is set in Pompeii. It follows a whole host of characters, but the main character is Amara. We first meet her in the Lupana in book 1 in the Wolf Den, where she's enslaved to Felix, working in the town brothel. That first book is all about her survival, her friendship with the women there, what she does in order to try and gain her freedom. In the second book, she does have a lot more agency. That's the House with the Golden Door, and she's freer to explore other aspects of her life, you know, love, friendship, her ambitions, but there are still sort of fairly major blocks on her autonomy, as there would have been for any kind of Roman women in her situation. And then in the third book, she's achieved a lot more material success in her life, a lot more political power, but it's also coinciding with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So from the start of the book, we'll be able to tell that the Temple of Fortuna is potentially going to be quite a lot of, a lot of it's about your own personal fortunes, the sort of role of fortune or chance itself in life, and yes, with Vesuvius being a very obvious example of how that can happen.
So the obvious first question has to be, now that we've come to the end of the trilogy, how does it feel to have it like out in the world now?
Oh, it's actually a huge relief. So I think the thing about writing a trilogy is that the feeling you get when you've finished a book that it's finished is not the case. So obviously you feel elated that you finished that particular book, but you haven't finished the story, you know, and a trilogy is not only judged on the merits of one book, but on all three individually, and also how they all hang together. So of course, you know, I'm nervous. I hope people like what I've done to bring the three books together, but ultimately I feel like the story's finally finished. Whereas for the last few years when I've been writing it, you know, I'm conscious that when one book's finished, I have to write the next one, and also sort of thinking about all those puzzle pieces, how it's all going to fit together, what's going to happen. They are all written as standalones too. So you could, I would say, particularly with the first two, you know, you can just read them as they are without, well, obviously you can read the first one first, but I mean, you can obviously read the second one without having read the first one. And you can do that again with book 3, but I think increasingly emotional depth is lost if you do that. So I think if you went into the Temple of Fortuna without having followed the characters in the previous 2 books, something is lost. You can 100% follow the story. I think it would still hopefully be very impactful emotionally, but yeah, it's you lose something.
Well, that's something that you've done so well throughout this series, is make this one big story whilst also having these three individual stories, these three individual themes that really drive those particular books. And something that I've always wondered from reading the first now to the third is how much of that did you know when you came up with the series idea? Like, did you always know kind of what the story was going to be? Did you know you wanted to tackle, you have the lives of enslaved people, book 1, freed people, book 2, and then, like you said, fortune, chance, the eruption, obviously, in book 3?
So I planned significant amounts of it right from the beginning. In terms of the Amara Felix arc, that was kind of something that I knew was going to run across all 3 books and be quite sort of momentous in terms of the direction of her life and the meaning that she chooses to make out of her life. In terms of book 2, so I did change, whilst writing The Wolf Den, I did change my idea of what I thought was going to happen to Amara as a main character. So, she's a very resourceful, resilient, sometimes very ruthless woman. She's incredibly pragmatic. She's a real survivor, but also she undergoes a lot of trauma. And so in writing The Wolf Den, I started to think that having her sort of become increasingly kind of badass and ruthless and out there is a common trajectory in fiction, but not in life. And so book 2 became much more reflective about when people are recovering from simply surviving their life and they're trying to live it. The type of decisions that they make, they're not always going to be the best decisions. They're just not. And also people are not only drawn towards personal power, they're also drawn towards relationships and love. And obviously that had been a huge solace for Amara in book 1, but not her main focus, in the sense of she's got this huge drive to survive and get out of the brothel. But, they are kind of the heart of her life, her emotional and romantic, not so much romantic, but certainly her emotional relationships. And so by the time book 2 comes along, it's about, okay, now she has space to think about love and relationships and friendship and all of these things in what they mean to her. So I think that took on a greater role than when I initially planned the trilogy. And also, the more that I thought about the volcano book at the end, the less I wanted it to be. I mean, I never wanted to just end on the volcano. That would be really crap for people. Just like, and then they all died, or we just don't know what happens. You've got all these story arcs that you've set up with such painstaking care, and people are invested in characters, and then if you just do a big wipeout, it's
just like everyone dies. Like that's
it. Yeah, exactly. Kind of, so I became aware quite early on, actually, that I wanted to write about the relief effort and the aftermath of Vesuvius as much as about the volcano itself. Probably Fortuna is the most difficult book to plan, because you've got to have a compelling plot for enough of the book before anyone even knows there's a volcano, because obviously the people of Pompeii didn't know there was going to be a volcanic eruption. So you have to, in a sense, write 2 books, a book that would have gone on a particular trajectory, just like the characters' lives, if no volcano had erupted, and that has got to be a compelling and driving enough plot in and of itself. And then you've got the eruption, and then how the eruption interacts with that original plot. So that was kind of the structure I was looking at, whereas you, of course, as the writer, are aware there's going to be an eruption. So it was a really strange book to write in that respect, I'd say.
Well, I was wondering that, actually, like, even with the first book, I was thinking about this, because for classics nerds as well, like, it's obvious that the volcano has to come into this at some point.
Yeah.
And my question has always been, and I've asked lots of other authors about this with their own particular, whether it be Greek mythology or whatever it is, with something as big as that, right? That this has to happen, and it has to happen in a particular way as well, because we have the source material of it. So we know, at least from the ancients, what it looked like. Is that a positive when writing? Like, does that kind of take a weight off that you're like, cool, this is how it has to go, so it's going to kind of write itself? Or is it in a way, because, as you said, you're writing these 2 storylines, which we'll include in the spoiler part, because I have so many questions about all of that. But you have then this other storyline, and it's more so like, oh gosh, now I have to stick this thing in the middle of it.
It's going to sound daft, but in book one, I really forgot that there was going to be a volcano in the series. It was so irrelevant to what was happening in the characters' lives. You know, it's a full 5 years before the eruption. They've got their own drama and stuff going on. And I think this is kind of, it would be like setting a novel in 2018. No one knows that there's going to be a COVID pandemic. Like literally nobody is sitting there apart from maybe a few nerds we should have paid more attention to who look at pandemic planning. You know, nobody is really spending their time thinking about, oh, I wonder how my life would be completely and utterly upended by a global pandemic. So in a sense, because the books are 3 individual items as well as part of a series, for the first 2, I didn't have to think about it really that much, and I didn't. It informed the character of Pliny because I obviously knew he was gonna, because in terms of the actual sort of historic events, you don't have a choice in covering. Pliny is pretty central to that, given his nephew is the eyewitness. Pliny the Younger is the eyewitness account, for which we have almost 90% of our information on the eruption, contemporary anyway. So the creation of Pliny's character, how he behaves in book 1 and book 2, is based on his nephew's accounts of his behavior, both during that crisis, but also, he talks about his uncle more generally and how he behaved. So I guess in that sense, I was very conscious of it. And certainly by book 2, you're starting to get earth tremors and things, but again, they're very backgroundy. We're not, I didn't want to do a sort of great big clunking foreshadowing of doom, which nobody experiences in their own life. That's the thing. These, massive events, both good and bad, come out of nowhere a lot of the time. So I think it probably was liberating rather than not. It was helpful for creating the character of Pliny. And I guess, because I knew that book 3 was going to be the volcano book, I didn't have to make all of the books the volcano book, and I could kind of get on with what was going on in the characters' lives before that.
Well, speaking of Pliny, which that I loved this part of the book, and this is not a spoiler, by the way. I've decided it's not a spoiler because we're not going to talk about the actual end of book 3, but a little scene in book 3 that I loved, and I messaged you in like all capitals as soon as I was reading this scene, was Pliny's bath. Now, this is iconic. And for anybody who's listened to Natalie Haynes Stands Up for the Classics, she also mentions how hysterically iconic this is from the source material. In hindsight, obviously not at the time, because like you said, he would have had no idea what was going on. But I found this a really interesting thing to include, because you could have just not included this part of Pliny's story. You could have had the characters go elsewhere, meet up with him later or whatever it is. And you were like, you know what? Pliny's going to get his bath and he's going to get his dinner, and we're going to let everybody see this. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Pliny's bath and why you chose to give him that in the book?
The Pliny's bath and that whole scenario of how he responded to the disaster, both his scientific curiosity that he wanted to see it up close, his humanitarian impulse, his sense of responsibility that he's trying to rescue people. These are the kind of really noble aspects of Pliny that I tried to reflect in how I imagined him in totally fictional kind of scenarios in earlier books. But there's also this total oddball streak that he had. He's a deeply quirky, eccentric character. I mean, his nephew, a different bath he's talking about, but I included it as an epigraph, Pliny and his baths. That's a whole essay there. But he says that Pliny was so obsessed and kind of intensely focused on his research, like total tunnel vision, that the only break he'd take from reading or being read to was his bath. And his nephew adds, just in case we're in any doubt, and by his bath I mean the actual physical immersion. So in the baths, where everyone else is like getting their wax and all the rest of it, they're like having their wax scraped off with strigils or whatever, Pliny is being read to or like trying to read. So why wouldn't he behave like this during a cataclysmic eruption? And this is exactly what his nephew records, that, you know, he goes to his friend's house in Stabii and they're sheltering for the night, and Pliny just is like, well, hey, let's, you know, we need to take a bath. I added the fact that because it's so dusty and dirty, like, why would he not want to have a bath? He doesn't want to sit there all grubby and look at all these grubby faces.
Makes sense.
And yeah, and you know, there are multiple kind of interpretations on why Pliny behaves like this. I mean, one is that he is just very quirky. I think also there's an element that he's attempting to maintain a sense of normality, both for himself and other people. You know, people respond to life-threatening situations in a variety of ways, and one of them is with this kind of almost like a type of denial, or at worst you could call it denial, at best you could say it's an attempt to maintain normality as much as you can, both to keep other people and yourself calm, and because also what else is there genuinely to do? You know, if he'd have sat there wailing in the courtyard with the ash raining down, would that have been more useful than having his bath? And I think Pliny the pragmatist would say no. Why not face death with a clean face? So that's what I imagined him doing.
It was also, I remember when I sent you that message, it was something like 11 p.m. at night or something. So I was like, Elodie needs to know right now. And your reply to me was also, well, I don't want everyone to think that everything's going to be fine now that Pliny's there. Like,
yeah,
it's just this idea of like,
yes,
we have to throw that in.
Yeah, well, this is it, because I think, you know, probably people would have responded to the admiral of the Roman fleet turning up, thinking things would be okay. I always remember, you know, I watched a documentary. I didn't actually think of this when I was writing so much. I did a little bit with the Pliny scene during the London riots about a decade ago, when, you know, there were like fires and stuff going on, and there were difficulty for the emergency services to get there. And I remember there was an interview with a police officer talking about the fact that they went in, even though they weren't trained, to rescue people from fires and sort of in a kind of ad hoc way. And he said, you know, how could you not? You know, people were desperate and they see the person in uniform and their assumption is, this person will save me. And so, of course, you have to try and do that, even though they weren't the fire service. You know, all emergency services have some degree of disaster training. And I just thought, Pliny's kind of like that police officer who's not a firefighter, but is doing that because that's their role, essentially. And so I guess for Pliny, he's the admiral of the Roman fleet. He represents Rome. He's attempting a rescue mission. He may quite possibly have worked out that this rescue mission ain't going to happen. Does he need to tell everyone that? You know, maybe not.
No, absolutely. And speaking of obviously the huge volcano as it erupts and the time period that it erupts in, something that as I was reading, I thought maybe lots of people don't know this, but obviously and I say obviously to you because you wrote the book, but not obviously to people who are just tuning in for the non-spoiler chat, that you set this during October of 79 AD.
Yeah.
Now, I think a lot of people like me would have been taught August of 79 AD, and this was the previous dating. But this has been a long conversation for you guys who are not in the nerdy world about when this was actually dated. And now we tend to fall towards October. So do you want to tell us a little bit about why that is? Like what made people think, very surface level, obviously this is a whole like trilogy in of itself to just discuss this thing.
So the August dating is due to the letters of Pliny, which were copied and copied and copied. So they obviously weren't the original letters of Pliny, which were written as 24th of August. However, some of the sort of produce, the figs, and I think it was pomegranates, but definitely figs that were found preserved at the site are suggesting a later date. I think there's some evidence that some of the harvest had taken place of the grapes, or potentially all the harvest. There was also a coin found that was minted later. The coin one is a little bit, I think, more, that's a bit more controversial, because I think some people are arguing that someone who'd gone into the site or tried to salvage things might have dropped a coin. I mean, whether that would be possible so soon after the eruption, I mean, the sense is, you know, scholarship has shifted to the idea that August was essentially a typo by a scribe in later centuries, and that they actually meant October. And that, you know, it being October rather than say September is, and to do with the sort of seasonal produce that was found. You could argue either case. I have to be honest, I didn't get wildly hung up on it. I picked the October date.
Well, there's no wrong answer.
There isn't a wrong answer. Yeah, we don't. There's certain compelling reasons to have gone with August for dramatic purposes, in the sense that that would mean it happened literally after the Vulcanalia, the day before, celebration of Vulcan, who amongst other things is god of volcanoes and fire and all the rest of it. So, you know, that dramatically was quite tempting. But I felt like on balance, you know, most scholars now go with the later date. And so I didn't want to be out of step with that, really.
No, absolutely. And for you guys who have just listened to that and like, oh, that sounds really interesting, I'll link some papers in the description below, because this is really hotly debated. This has been a very long discussion. So I thought that we might as well include that, because I was like, what if there are people...
hotly debated. Yeah, it is hotly debated. And I have to be honest, in the end, it was a bit like toss a coin, because I'm not the expert, and I don't want to be casual about something that obviously exercises a lot of people very intensely. But in the end, that seemed the more compelling case to me. So that's what I went with.
No, fair enough. Again, there's no wrong answer. So everybody can do their own research. That's what I love about historical fiction, though, is that it does propel people to get into things and to get interested and to get really stuck into the ancient world. But because this is historical fiction, we should talk about some of your fictional choices as well. So your lovely characters are your fictional choices. And when it comes to a number of them, they are so, I mean, all of them actually, they are so distinct and they're so strong. Like, as soon as they talk, I find with your writing, I don't need you to tell me who said it afterwards, because I know whose really voice it is. So I was wondering with those, who was the hardest to get that down with? Like, was there a character in particular, even, you know, characters who we've not seen for a while, like Dido, for example, or any of those? Was there one that you found quite difficult to get your head into?
I really enjoyed Pliny, as might be obvious. He's so different from all the other characters. It's always nice to write an oddball. I think Philos, possibly, in the sense that he's a really good man. I didn't want to make him too sickly sweet, you know, too implausibly good. Like, people complain that all the men in the wolf den are awful, and I don't think I think Rufus in book 1 isn't so awful, you know, and Menander's not awful. Obviously we learn more about Rufus, but he's, yeah, I would say book 1 Rufus is, that's probably a spoiler. Felix, I will allow, is clearly awful. But yeah, so I think trying to be realistic about Philos, I mean, he ended up being, in some ways, my favorite character.
He's my favorite character. Spoiler for everybody. I love him. I think he's great.
Yeah, I love Philos. I think also, and I don't just mean as a kind of romantic hero, though, you know, that is one of the roles that he has in the book. But I think Philos really obliged me to, it made the Wolf Den trilogy not just about the suffering of women, I think, and made it about something else, in that I don't think Philos's experiences and Amara's experiences of enslavement are so different, because men also face sexual exploitation, and kind of almost more of an existential threat. I think that's what I was kind of grappling with in writing Philos, in the sense that, you know, a slave was kind of not allowed to be a man, in the sense of what it meant to be a man to the Romans was in control, dominant, oppressive in many ways. Certainly in sexual relationships, you know, the dominance and the control is male, the submission and all the rest of it is female. I'm not saying the Romans didn't understand that women enjoyed sex and could be active and all the rest of it, but this wasn't how their roles were defined. And so, yeah, I guess sort of existentially, how do you define yourself as a good man when that is not how society perceives you? Whereas women of all social classes were considered lesser and had to sort of internalize that cognitive dissonance of, you know, everyone's the hero of their own story. All of us, you know, we're the most important person in our own world. I don't mean that in a narcissistic way, but, you know, the only perspective we truly get in life is our own. We can empathize with other people's perspective. So, you know, for somebody who's enslaved, like Philos, how does he build his own worldview? How does he make sense of himself when everything is so negative on him? Yeah, so that was something. And, you know, he does this very gracefully, with keeping a balance between being quite strong in himself and who he is, whilst also, I didn't want to be unrealistic of him sort of stomping around like a romantic macho hero who could come in and save the day. He can't do that. So in what other ways is he a good man? So yeah, I found him very interesting to write.
You know what, though? You are the queen, in my opinion, of writing incredibly realistic historical fiction. And that's something I've said the entire time I've been reading your books, and every time I can mention it. The reason why I think I love them so much is that you're not scared to be realistic about this world, even if it doesn't equal, you know, the character necessarily that you want, the romantic character.
Yeah, and some people will find the behavior of some of the main characters wildly dislikable because they are, and rightly so. You know, Amara was enslaved in book 1. In book 2, she owns other people, and that was an absolutely accurate journey that freed people would take. Like most freed people who had any money whatsoever would go on to own others. So, you know, yeah, I didn't want, you know, sometimes you do read historical fiction, and thank you for saying that, but where characters are granted access to sort of moral ideas or an ethical framework that they would not have had access to, they wouldn't have been able to think that way. So yeah, that's something that I tried to avoid on the whole. I push it, you know, in the Amara Philos relationship, I do push that, but then we do have examples of very touching romantic relationships from all time periods between men and women. You know, it's not always completely dominated by power struggle. So
absolutely. And I want to pick up on that in our little spoiler part. So to wrap up this part, just to like sort of leave some people off who have not finished the series, who maybe haven't picked up Temple of Fortuna, or maybe just after book 1 or halfway through book 2, whatever it is. For those people, can you just tell them what we can expect from you in the future?
Yes. So I'm staying with the Romans. I'm going further back to Roman Britain and Boudicca's rebellion. The focus is not actually Boudicca's rebellion. The book's called Boudicca's Daughter, and it's about one of her 2 daughters. So a bit like the volcano, the rebellion is going to happen probably, I haven't completely finished planning this book, but relatively early in the book. So this is, I hope, looking at that part of history in an unfamiliar way, or a less familiar way. It's also got a cameo from one character in the Wolf Den trilogy, which is Britannica. So she is a child. She's not a main character because she's only a child in the time period. But yeah, she's in it as well.
So with that in mind, we should probably end this part of the interview. So for you guys who are watching that want to see all of the spoilers, do stick around, because I'm just going to wrap up the video right now for all of you guys that haven't read the final book. So thank you guys, to all of you who are about to clock off, for tuning into this video, for engaging with this content. Hopefully you guys have already gone down to the description below, but if you haven't already, then do go and check it out down there, because not only are there links to the Temple of Fortuna, but there are links to buy the rest of the series as well. So The House with the Golden Door and the Wolf Den are linked below, as well as my first interview with Elodie, which we've referenced a few times throughout this chat. I hope that I'll keep all those parts in the final cut, but if not, I do have another interview with Elodie that just focused on the Wolf Den. So all of that is in the description below. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Mona Inc. So I'll see you guys then. Now that everybody's left though, and it's just us gals here and whoever else wants to sit, that's completely fine. So the first question I have to address is the whole Amara and Felix storyline and how Amara kills Felix. We've got to start there. Like, as the author, and you said you had planned out a lot of this character arc. Did you know this from like book one, or did this surprise you?
No, this was what was going to happen.
What? Yeah. Why did you feel like Amara like should get to do this? Like she should get this over Felix after, because let me tell you, I literally was like, this man is a roach. How did he survive this? How did his entire family die? And yet he's crawled out of some corner.
I mean, that is awful. I mean, to be fair, that is a classic trope where the villain pops up. I'm not immune for the odd trope. Yeah, so I always knew that this was going to happen. I didn't know the exact scenario in which it would unfold, but that was the story arc between Felix and Amara. It's because, you know, the whole series is a power struggle between them. It's also something, they mirror each other in many ways. In some ways, he is like her. It's a very uncomfortable relationship. It's predominantly hate. There is also love there. Very twisted form of love, but it is a form of love between them. It's certainly, a very profound, they have a very profound attachment to each other, which is, 90% toxic. And, it's in many senses a vengeance trilogy as well. It's a revenge trilogy. The classical world was all up for revenge. So yeah, that's the story arc. And when I wrote the scene in The House with the Golden Door with Britannica, when she's teaching Amara sword play, or not sword play, that's the wrong word. She's teaching her how to defend herself with a knife, much more basic. It's not kind of some noble thing. And, I knew that scene would be enacted, that Amara would use that knowledge eventually against Felix. I worried that would be really obvious, but I'm really glad that it wasn't.
You know what? I think it was just that I really got tied up in this happily ever after. And so when Amara goes for her little walk, I was like, no, stop it. That's not happening right now. Like I was so geared up towards, and then they just walked off into the sunset. And so when he came up, again, the roach, I was literally like, oh my God, go away. I actually sat up on the sofa and yelled at the book. I was like, I can't.
Well, I think she's kind of got a similar feeling about it. It's and it also, that's sort of central to Amara's character is the idea that you're only as good as the choices that you face. Like this defines her. She is faced with choices in life, and sometimes none of those choices are good. What choices does she have with Felix? She can be blackmailed by him. I mean, that's just going to completely destroy her life. She can let him do his worst. That will destroy her life. Or she can destroy him. So this is what she does.
Well, you know what? The question I was wondering as well, which maybe you're about to be like, hate to pop your bubble, Erica, but yes, I also knew this. Philos and Amara's happily ever after. This I was surprised by as well, which I loved. Like I loved that you gave them their little happily ever after. But I was broken in book 2. Like, and I want to stress this. Like I was a fragment of like a reader on my bed. I was like, I cannot believe that she's leaving him. Like, what's happening?
Yeah.
So did you know then as well? You're like,
yes,
ha ha ha,
absolutely.
I'm going to let the readers cry.
No, I knew the volcano would give her another opportunity. So but this was also really central to how I envisaged the volcano, in that, and this might sound a bit nuts, but I didn't want to see it as something wholly tragic and bad in terms of the individual lives of the individual characters, because we know that some people did profit from it. And if you were an enslaved person like Philos or Menander, also pops up, not Roach-like.
What an angel. I was traumatized. Book 1, traumatized by the pot scene. I've mentioned it so much. And the fact that he got his little nice happy ending, I was
happy
like,
ever after as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So, for them, like, of course, they're going to be desperate about people that they lost in Pompeii, but, you're not going to have such an attachment to living the life of an enslaved person, and this is an opportunity to do something else. So I always saw that this sort of massive shift in population and in changing fortunes and all the rest of it would be a kind of mixed scenario, and that obviously it's horrific, it is horrific, but some people will take advantage of the horror. I mean, some people, Roach-like, as you say, with Felix, he's getting money, tracking down people who have got false identities and handing them over to the authorities. So, yeah.
Something else that I was thinking of as I was reading, as well as, just as you're speaking, is that dynamic between Amara and Rufina, her daughter. And I found it really touching and really interesting as a dynamic for you to get in, because obviously we've seen you get into the friendships within the Wolf Den. Friendships might be a strong word for some of them. And then, as Amara progresses throughout her story, the relationships that she has with other people. But I thought that her relationship with her daughter was really interesting. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to word this, because obviously it is sad, but it then looks up at the end, and I think it's a really complex relationship is probably the best way of putting it. So one thing I've been dying to ask you is, what is it like writing that kind of a motherly daughter relationship within this historical context?
I definitely think that I was aware that the ending might be a bit Marmite for some who wanted to see Amara end up, super powerful, independent woman. But I think that women in all time periods face this tension between a family life, and the rest of their identity. And of course, in the Roman era, a woman was not supposed to have an identity outside of a family life, but a courtesan was really, really outside of that, in an unusual way. And so, although courtesans faced all kinds of issues and discrimination and, financial precariousness and all the rest of it, they did have a degree of agency which was unusual. Courtesans, and then even more so, some of the more powerful, independently rich, elite women could hold this type of personal power. But what matters in the end, really, is it the people in our lives? What is it? So Amara is obliged to sort of make that choice, I think, which comes with a degree of sacrifice.
I think that's a really important point, is just that, courtesans were kind of like this different kind of job. And as well, I think what's interesting about Amara's story is that we see her from being totally enslaved and having here's the cap on absolutely everything that you can do, and she kind of has to stumble through, okay, now I have more rights. And you can see in her character, especially in Temple of Fortuna, when she's she brings all of the jewels and everything back from Rome down to Pompeii, this idea of if this all goes away, because it can, because I've experienced that, what does it mean for my child? What does it mean for this one person that I'm literally doing everything for?
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think, for Amara, who got a lot of love from her parents, but no financial stability, which had the most disastrous consequences on her life, she struggles to give her daughter love because she's physically absent, but she is trying to give her material stability. And also, I think for Amara, sort of wealth, money acquisition carries huge, enormous emotional significance as well, because this is her means of protecting herself and the people that she loves. So I didn't see, I didn't see this sort of ending with Philos as a completely uncomplicated happy ever after for her, because there is stuff about her own identity that she gives up, and this is in some ways why at the end she still feels like Amara rather than Timariti.
No,
So
absolutely, absolutely. Like, again, that's something that I loved about her character arc, which is just that you can see all of these anxieties, you can see all of this like almost identity crisis in her character, especially at the end, which I think is so, I think that's what makes your books also and your characters really come to life, that even though I don't get the situation, I can understand emotions of your characters and what they're going through and connect to them in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, nobody gets a happy ever after in all aspects of themselves, in all aspects of their life. Amara gets her family, she gets love, she does get a degree of financial stability. She is not at the bottom of the barrel by any means, but she's absolutely not anywhere near where she was in terms of personal power, wealth, just the connections. Pliny is dead, but it's also her connection to Pliny's world is severed, because she can no longer be Amara in order for Philos to be Fidelius. So it's and their dynamic as well. I mean, Philos is an absolute angel, so he's not abusing that situation, but I also wanted to reflect how Philos becomes the more powerful in that relationship in terms of how society perceives them, and she is diminished by that. And that, I think, as feminists, obviously that's not something we want to be like yay about, but I wanted to be realistic about it.
Well, I think that you showed it as well, like, when they go down to the port and they're trying to get back to Pompeii, and like Philos has to be the one to step forward because she has to, adopt that. And oh my God, the trauma that I felt as a reader when they get back to Pompeii, and all of a sudden lots of people who are going to actually out their true identities are still there. I'm saying, even though we're in the spoiler part, I'm not going to say who, but there are people there who are like, oh, funny, we're going under these names now. And you're like, are they going to play along? Are they going to help them? Or, at every turn, it seems like, God, this poor couple is just this problem after problem after problem.
Yeah, I think so. And, so they're both, for Philos, it's he's not losing anything at all. He's gaining the world by the end of the book. Because, of course, although he lives with the permanent threat of pretty, I mean, let's not be messing around, pretty horrible death. The consequences for the family would be pretty horrendous if they were discovered. And so, Amara's choosing to place her daughter in a degree of risk, but she's also giving her father, and it's a very complex choice that she makes. I think some people are a bit ungenerous to Amara sometimes. The fact that she sacrificed her relationship with Menander in book 1, and then in book 2 she has to leave Philos. Her choice then not to leave Philos in book 3 is quite fraught, I think.
Well, it certainly is like a new Amara in that sense, because we've established that, like, she's, again, sink or swim. This is the real life scenario that if this character were real, would have been in. And so even though, when she initially leaves Philos, I was really sad, but I'm like, what else is she going to do? Like, she doesn't have the other option. And now she does, which I'm like, that's quite nice that she got, like, it was a realistic happy ending to me.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, because it is a happy ending. Amara and Philos, I think they're going to have, sorry, it sounds so funny to talk about them as if they're real people, but they've got every hopes of building a very happy life. They're both intelligent people. They will find fulfillment in their business. That bit when she says she wants nothing more than to be with him until she no longer desires him so much, when he's become boring to her, that's where they'll end up. She's not going to be passionately, wildly in love with him forever and think he's the hottest guy on the planet. But they have a lot more than that as a relationship. He is her family. So, and they've obviously got their daughter as well. I think, that the mother-daughter relationship with Amara is quite tragic in some ways, but the choice that she makes at the end is also allowing herself to rebuild that relationship too. So, you know, and I didn't want to be sentimental about Rufina or who she is as a person. Like, she's very much a mixture of both her parents, and Phyllis is still her favorite parent even by the end of the book. You know, it's, yeah.
But that's like, they have such a sweet relationship. Like,
they do have a very special relationship. Yeah,
so wholesome. And even like when she doesn't know that that's her dad, the whole time I was like, if only
yeah.
I knew. Because like when Rufus comes in and she's like trying to get his, you know, anything from him, like not just his approval, but just any kind of reaction, he's like,
I know, he can barely look at her. He's really uninterested.
Exactly. And then you've got Philos come in and he's so excited with her, and like he's so engaged, and she only, like, she's oftentimes screaming just because she wants to hang out with him. I was like, that's so wholesome. That like, and even then, you know, at the end, and I like seeing that with Philos, because at least to me, and again, we'll talk about the characters as if they're real, but it kind of gave me that encouragement that could be Amara as well with her, because it's like, well, we've seen Rufina. I think
and it's more, it's, you know, she is, you know, both physically and emotionally closer to her daughter by the end of the book. You know, there's scenes when they're in the fast food restaurant and Rufina's sitting on her knee and then she's sitting between them. You know, it's because one of the things that I found very affecting in my research was, you know, reading about the lives of enslaved and freed people and the enormous weight that they put on family relationships, because that is something that they were denied. You know, and so the chance to get to keep your family close, to belong to them is, you know, such a precious goal of people who are denied that. And so, you know, for all three of them, Amara, Philos and Rufina, and, you know, there's the intimation that Amara is pregnant at the end as well, you know, the future of that particular family. And the family unit that they're building outside with Menanda and Irene, you know, so, because I could not end the trilogy without Amara having a female bestie. Like, yeah,
after everything.
But, yeah, she's got to have a bestie. Like, the female relationships have been the core of her life. So I wanted to show that continuing in a new relationship that she's formed with another woman. But that is also going to be a huge part of her life too. It's not just her family unit.
What are you going to miss most about these characters?
I will miss the characters, but at the same time, I do very much feel like I've got them to a place where I don't want to, certainly at this point, continue the stories. I feel like the Amara Felix arc is kind of the backbone of the trilogy, and that is completed. And in terms of, you know, I think we can see where Amara and Phyllis's relationship is going, and it's somewhere good. You know, it's yeah, but potentially not somewhere terribly exciting. You know, that's kind of it as well. Like, what am I going to write about? Like, the fun times they have in the shop. You know, this is what a happy life is. You know, a happy life is made up of lots of small, precious moments, you know, of things that aren't massive. You know, if you, the whole thing about may you not live in interesting times, you don't want your times to be too interesting, because that means you're probably having a crisis or the world around you is in crisis. So yeah, and I'm excited about meeting new characters and exploring new relationship dynamics. I think relationship dynamics are what, besides the sort of whole nerdy recreation of the ancient world, which is a massive passion, and I'm not sure I've even reflected how much of a passion that is. I mean, that is what I'm going to miss most, is writing about Pompeii. And the scene that I write in the end when Amara mentally walks through her memories of the town, you know, those are my imaginary memories of that town. You know, I've just loved the whole reality of Pompeii, of recreating it, of thinking about it, of all the sort of nitty-gritty aspects of life, the graffiti. I'm going to find it very strange to write about a world that isn't based in that physical material reality. I will miss that a lot. The characters, I feel like I've got them to where they're okay to leave them where I've left them, you know. And yeah, besides the kind of nerdy side of historical fiction, what I really enjoy is relationships, and I'm very much looking forward to a number of the relationships in Boudicca's Daughter. I think I'll have a really interesting time writing that.